Welcome to Nas Trilhas da Razão. I am today with Shari Tishman. Shari is a senior research associate and principal investigator at Harvard Project Zero, where she formerly served as director. Her research focuses on the development and teaching of thinking, the role of close observation in learning, and learning in and through the arts. Along with Project Zero colleague Liz Dawes Duringson, is it that correct?
Yes, Duringson, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Shari co-directs the Open Canopy project, formerly called Out of Eden Learn. The author of numerous books and articles, Shari's most recent books are The Open Canopy Handbook, Slowing Down, Sharing Stories, Making Connections, with co-author Liz Dawes Duringson, and Slow Looking, The Art and Practice of Learning Through Observation. Along with Project Zero colleague David Perkins, Shari is also the co-host of the Thinkability podcast. And let me add, Shari, that you have two of your books are edited in Brazil. The first one is The Culture of Thinking, yeah, right? And the other is Slow Looking, right? No, sorry, Careful.
No, I think
Slow
it's,
Looking, yes.
I know that we talked about the
Yeah,
word translation during the translation, but
yes.
in
But
English, it's slow looking.
yes, it's olhar atento in Portuguese. So, well, Shari, thank you for being here with us and
My
for
pleasure. Thank you.
sharing your time and knowledge with us. Well, Shari, you're an educator and you have invested your time in writing about thinking and looking and researching about these topics. And how did you get interested in those things?
Oh, well, that's a great question. Thank
Because
you.
let me just because an educator can be interested in many different aspects of education, in like autonomy, in critical thinking, in intellectual virtues. And
Yeah, no, and it's interesting, people's paths take different routes, as of course you know, and I can say that this is not what I started out thinking I was going to devote my life to. I actually started out way back studying philosophy in college, and I got my undergraduate degree in philosophy, and I didn't quite know what to do. I kind of didn't want to go to graduate school. I just didn't know what to do, and I got a quirky job just by chance teaching in an after-school program in a middle school, grades, students 11 through 13, say, teaching a program called Philosophy for Children, which was then popular then. And it was thought about as a way to teach critical thinking. The program where I was working, the focus was on what is often called gifted and talented education. And I quickly felt that, hey, wait a second, this stuff is really great. Shouldn't just be for gifted students. I was interested, and I became really interested in how to have conversations with young people that really engaged their thinking skills and what I would come to later think of as their thinking dispositions. And I got really excited about that. It was sort of like in practiced epistemology, thinking about teaching and learning, but in a really practical setting. So one thing led to another, and I eventually entered a doctoral program in philosophy of education, and I had the incredible good fortune to study with the philosopher Israel Scheffler, which I believe other of your guests have studied with. I know Harvey Siegel was there at the same time that I was. And then in another piece of really good fortune, I was a young starving student, and I needed a job. So I got a work study or a research assistant job at a place called Project Zero at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And for those who don't know, Project Zero is a research center at Harvard and its name is a little bit of a misleading because instead of one project, it's a loosely linked group of projects that at that time were run by two different principal investigators, David Perkins and Howard Gardner, both of whom are at Project Zero and both of whom are still around at Project Zero. And I was just really fortunate to work on an interesting project that focused on developing thinking strategies. And that was 35 years ago. And I've been there ever since. I think it took me about 10 years to realize I wasn't going to leave because the work was interesting. And that's the long ago story.
And Shari, you mentioned you worked with philosophy for children. The program, was it based on Matthew Lipman's ideas? or it was a
Um,
different one?
Matthew Lippman's ideas, but I actually worked a little bit more closely with somebody else named Gareth Matthews, who was also working in the field of philosophy of children. So I was drawing on both those resources, but I was kind of also making it up as I was going along when I was working with those great middle school students.
Wow. Sherry, I was about to ask you about the project you mentioned that, and how do you see your work nowadays? Is it connected to Project Zero in certain ways, or you have like taken different paths?
No, well, I am still connected to Project Zero. For quite a long time, I was also teaching at the School of Education in a program called Arts and Education, but I stopped doing that a little while ago. But I've always been with Project Zero, and it's hard to leave because different research projects come along and they're very interesting. And it's like having one job that's really many. It's hard to stay because Project Zero is entirely grant funded, so we're always looking for funds. But I've been fortunate to be able to spend my career here, and I am still at Project Zero.
Well, fine. Uh, in the book, The Thinking Classroom, it was of 1996, the first edition of the book. We have the Brazilian edition is from 1999. Sherry, there you present various ways to create and strengthen a culture of thinking in school. They're all very interesting, but you could focus on some of them to discuss a little bit which ways we teachers can foster thinking in classrooms, such like the language of thinking and development thinking positions. Um, which strategies do you think, Sherry? I mean, the question is very wide, but think of, let's mention one or two strategies. Which strategy do you think are more prone to help students to be better thinkers? You
That's a
had to
question.
pick, like, if you have to pick one or two to mention, this one is really great.
Well, it's a great question, and actually that question has driven so much of my work, and I will be honest with you, I do not have a full complete answer to that. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you the same question because I think I might learn from how you think about this and what you do as well. But let me maybe back up a little bit and say something about the idea of thinking dispositions,
Perfect.
and then use that as a way of sort of talking about what I think one or two key strategies might be. So, when we wrote that book, The Thinking Classroom, it came out of some work we had been doing earlier than that, talking to various people in the field of critical thinking and philosophy of education, about how, at the time, it was a time where people were starting to think again about cultivating creativity and cultivating critical thinking, and how can we teach thinking skills. So in the air at that time was a lot of focus on what skills should we teach students in order to be good thinkers. Well, we should teach them skills from logic. We should teach them how to look at both sides of the case. We should teach them argument skills. We should teach them problem solving skills. And all that sounded really good. But we wondered, isn't being a good thinker more than just a matter of skill? Isn't it also in part a matter of character, or sort of how you're disposed to be in the world, especially intellectually? So we developed this idea of thinking dispositions as a way of sort of pushing beyond the notion of just skill. As you know, you can have a skill without using it. So we wanted to know what it took to use that skill. So we developed this notion of thinking dispositions. And we were lucky to get a grant from the MacArthur Foundation to sort of do a little proof of theory work, research, try to figure out whether this concept, which we had sort of developed, really could hold water, really worked out in practice. And the concept was basically very simple. It said, in order to be the kind of person who digs into critical thinking challenges, who digs into creative thinking challenges, not only do you have to have these skills that are very important that we just talked about, but also you have to be motivated to want to think critically and to think creatively. And also we proposed, or we hypothesized, you have to not only have the skill, not only be motivated, but you actually have to notice occasions when it's important to think critically, or think creatively. So we worked out this kind of complicated bit of research where we could try to test for the contribution of those three elements to how people actually thought critically and creatively or didn't in real life contexts. And we developed a rather elaborate test, and without going into all the details, the results were pretty surprising to us at the time. And basically what the results said to us is the roadblock isn't not having a skill. In other words, when people fail to think critically or fail to think creatively, it's not necessarily because they don't know how to do it. And it's not necessarily because they're not motivated to do it. Sometimes they have both the skill and the motivation. But what they lack is what we call the sensitivity, the alertness to the occasion. So just to give a really super quick example, you might know how to recognize an overgeneralization or recognize a creative problem-solving situation. You might be motivated to go past overgeneralizations, or you might be motivated, perhaps a better example is you might be motivated to think out of the box and not just stick to the regular way of thinking things. And you might even, if somebody said, how should people think outside of the box, or how should somebody deal with overgeneralizations, you might be able to give an answer to that. But what you might miss is noticing occasions where it's important to do so. And that's because the flow of life happens and we just don't tend to be alert to our surroundings sometimes. Okay, so that's a long-winded way of saying, if the bottleneck is sensitivity, if the bottleneck is getting us to notice in the middle of the flow and we might not be alert to things, what strategies can we develop to help students notice occasions? And that's a question that I still feel like I have not fully answered in my life. But I think one piece of the answer is to make it habitual. In other words, you've already got a lot going on in your mind. So if you can make something just a habit, then you're more likely to notice it. And it's from that idea of making something habitual that the idea of thinking routines came about, and thinking routines, which I'll explain in a minute, are an answer to the question, how can we get people to use their thinking dispositions or their thinking skills at moments when it counts? And the answer is to develop little habits of mind that alert you as a matter of course. So if your habit of mind is always to stop, make a couple of observations, ask a couple of questions, no matter, in any kind of thinking context, then you're much more likely than otherwise to sort of follow through on thinking critically or creatively about that. So for many years, Project Zero and now others as well have done a lot of work developing thinking routines, which are sort of short little strategies that educators can teach young people to get them sort of thinking as a matter of course, as a matter of habit. So that's one piece of the answer. And then another piece of the answer that you yourself mentioned is sort of creating a cultural surround. I guess the big answer is you download as many prompts for thinking as you can to free up mental space. So if we download some onto habits or thinking routines, we can download others onto the cultural surround of the educational context, whether that's in the language that you as an educator use, so that you're using words that cue thinking, words like hypothesis, or as we were saying, thinking out of the box. You might create sort of feedback and even visual prompts in the environment that all support thinking so that it starts happening as a matter of habit. And of course, there's much more to say, but Guilherme, let me turn to you and ask you what you do, because I know you think a lot about teaching thinking, and I know you're in a teaching context.
I was Shari, heavily influenced by your first book, and there are many things that you've written there, your colleagues, that I still try to incorporate in my own classes. And I usually think of modeling as a part of an important part of having an environment that fosters thinking. I agree completely with you when you say that you need to have an environment that is with students educators, everyone is concerned about the quality of their thinking. And I usually try to model in terms of this is something that I don't feel comfortable in saying that I am a model of a thinker, but I try to do my best. I think all educators are, to a certain degree, models to their good and bad. They can be either good and bad models, right? So I try to be the best model I can. And I try to incorporate like appropriate words to refer to thinking. This is something you've written in your book as well. And I try to proportionate my claims to the quality of evidence there is for them. I tend to I refrain from exaggerating things. I try to be careful when I use language. I teach science, so this is a very interesting field in which you can discuss evidence, reasons, and I try to so modeling. I think I try to think aloud when I am dealing with a question and I am answering. I usually don't answer questions directly. I prefer to try to deal with them in a way that I think can be useful to students to figure out what are the implications, analogies, and other things we can extract from the question and even learn more than if I simply gave the answer. So I usually try to incorporate these strategies. I think they're quite simple in the sense that they do not demand much from the educator, but they demand our attention. I think this is an important thing. We need to be aware that the way we teach a class is we need to be aware of how we teach a class, the way the strategies we incorporate and why we incorporate them. I also use other strategies. I think Ron Richard's book and the Project Zero also they elaborate a list of strategies for the fostering of thinking, and one of them is I used to think, now I think. I try to I elaborate some exercises. This is a very interesting one, and I even apply to myself when I am talking to friends about topics on science, pseudoscience, and other things. Oh, I used to think about, something. Now I think, and I usually uh, do this exercise even in some classrooms. I open my own thinking. Look, I used to think that. Now I think that because A, B, and C. So this is I try to incorporate as much as I can these strategies.
You've just said so many things that I resonate with. I really love how you put all of that. And, I think modeling thinking is so important. And maybe in a minute you'll tell me one or two special things that you like to model. But some of what I was hearing you saying are things that I try to model too. And others I know do as well. I mean, just showing that giving thinking time, showing, one of the things that actually I remember when I got my very first work study job that I was telling you about with David Perkins, I was amazed because he used to ask him a question, and he modeled giving thinking time. He'd model, give me a minute to think about that. And then he'd take 15 or 20 seconds and then he'd respond. And I remember thinking, my jaw sort of dropped. It's like, you can do that? But that's a tremendously important thing to model because it sends the message that thinking does take time. And I think also, as you were saying, looking at, showing evidence sometimes on both sides of the case, pointing out that evidence can change, pointing out that evidence is sometimes incomplete. And another thing that I think you mentioned, or at least it seemed like you mentioned, that I think is such a powerful kind of model is asking people what they think, because it's, it communicates that building knowledge is a two-way or a multi-way process rather than just from me to you process. So I love all of that. And, you ended up by mentioning the thinking routine, used to think, now I think, which is such a powerful thinking routine. And we use that so much in our work too. We use it, I use it myself in just the way that you do. It's a beautiful model for people. It's an epistemological model. It shows that knowledge is something that changes over time, right? And that is such a key understanding. for any of us. And in a very practical way, even in our research now, and maybe you do this in your own work as well, we used to think, now I think, as a qualitative evaluation measure. We might try something out. We want to know, instead of doing a pre-test and a post-test, or maybe in addition to doing a pre-test and a post-test, finding out what people's perceived changes is tremendously revealing. Cool.
And
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I usually, Shari, I also ask people, as you said, I try to cultivate an open environment in the classroom in which people feel free to offer their opinions. But I also always remember Harvey Siegel's idea of respecting persons, in the sense that you need to ask people why they believe something, why they have a certain conclusion, because this is the way you can move on, right? You can think about why you believe something, and you can also think if the reasons you think are good are really good for a certain conclusion. So this is a kind of metacognitive activity that I usually try to foster when I can, whenever I can. And I think it's important, not only for students, but also for educators to think about reasons. We are used to do many things in classroom, or believe in many things, taking many ideas for granted, and we spend a little time thinking about why we believe something, even in our pedagogical creeds as well. And I think it's very important to ask for reasons, and to be able to investigate the reasons, to think about the reasons, to reflect upon them, because as you said before, we can improve, we can change, we can change the level of confidence we have on a certain conclusion if we reflect upon the reasons that sustain it.
I so agree with you. Just asking why is a model of a very powerful kind.
Yeah, that's perfect. Here, talking about the thinking classroom and moving from the thinking classroom to your next book. One of the fundamental points of the thinking classroom is for students and educators to pay attention to their thinking process. We were talking about that, so that they can improve these thinking processes, right? This seems to be the premise of your other book, Slow Looking. In Portuguese is Olhar, Atento, right? This one. But this time is the idea that we can train our observation skills so that we can be better at it. Why is it important for schools to be concerned with making students better observers?
Well, fair warning, I'm going to ask you that same question in a minute, but I'll say a little bit first, because as a science educator, something I suspect you've thought deeply about. Well, I think there are lots of reasons. I mean, one is simply as a counter to fast culture. I mean, we live in an increasingly fast-paced world. All of us educators know that. And it's, it goes against the tide or against the grain to just slow down and look closely, particularly to look closely without necessarily looking in order to support a hypothesis or in order to get someplace else. So just, I think, as a counter to fast culture, and also, I'm not going to put it all on the external culture. Also, our minds work fast, and sometimes it takes a bit of mindful thinking to slow ourselves down. So that's one reason. Another reason is that outside of science class or art classes, it's often not taught, slowing down and making careful observations. And there's a couple of other reasons that actually stand out to me even more, which is, and from the perspective of critical, or the teaching of thinking, you and I have both been involved in the teaching of thinking for a long time, and especially when I came into it, most people talked about critical thinking as something that involved making decisions or reaching conclusions or basic or explanations or interpretations. So if you think of a continuum, and on one end of the continuum, you have sort of traditional outcomes of critical thinking, like making good decisions, making well-supported interpretations, giving careful explanations, taking well thought through actions in the world. These are all really important things to do that critical thinking supports. But way at the other end of the continuum, you can think of discernment, noticing the world really carefully, seeing nuance, seeing complexity, seeing multiple dimensions, not in order to support a decision or an action or a hypothesis or an explanation, but just in order to learn more about the world. So I think of this sort of continuum between discernment on one side, which is where careful observation and slow looking would go, and deciding on the other end, which is where sort of more traditionally conceived critical thinking would go. And I just don't think we give a lot of attention to discernment. So that's one of the reasons I've become really interested in it. And then the last thing I'll say, I think, refers back to something that you mentioned, which, or certainly you suggested, is that in when you ask students why or whatever, is that when you start looking closely for yourself and making careful observations, you see things in a way that nobody else does. You notice specifics, nuances, complexities, discernments that are yours and yours alone, and you see really vividly how your own observations contribute to building knowledge. So I think that slowing down, learning to make careful observation, shows you that you're a participant in this sort of larger enterprise of building knowledge because you're the one making the observation. And in my experience in working with learners of all ages, from graduate students to kindergartners, it tends to be really motivating. And I wonder if you have found this as a science educator when learners make their own observations. It's suddenly exciting. I saw this. This is something that I can look at, that I can notice. And so I think that all of these reasons combine to make a sort of a powerful argument for the power of slow looking. And I'm going to just say one more thing before I'm going to ask you what you think, which is that I have found that young people are surprised by how much they enjoy the opportunity to slow down and look carefully at the world once they get over that little hump of having the structure of doing so. What do you think?
Yeah, Shari, I think in science, for instance, slow looking helps us to understand how complex things are. When you, I mean, the most simple examples are like when you get a plant and you look at its structures. It's, as I say, when you see for yourself, it's something very interesting. And I also I have a class on evolutionary biology, and one of the ideas they usually develop with the students is to look at domestic animals and try to figure out what can they teach us about evolution by natural selection. And as Darwin did, when the same when he wrote The Origin of Species, the first chapter of his book was based on his observations and his conversations with people who had domesticated animals and plants as well. So he drew an analogy between a process that was man-made and a process that was like made by nature, natural selection. And when we stop and think about the diversity of dogs, for example, dog breeds, and we start thinking about how they came to be the way they are, this is like uh, I am in awe when I think of that. So look, people could do that in 200-300 centuries, and I think these kind of observations make us not only appreciate the complexity of science, but also they helps us to be more curious about that, about like what can domestic animals teach us about evolution. So let's see domestic dogs, cats, plants as well. Observe, compare them, compare their structures, behavior, and I mean we can learn a lot from that. And this is one of the things I do relate to observation in the sense that observing stories, comparing stories, and comparing like animals, plants, and so on. This is for us in science. It's an extraordinary way to understand not only the nuance, as you said correctly, the nuance of the reasons that are involved in evolution, for example, but also the complexity of life in general.
Oh, I love your example, and your mention of domestic animals and domestic plants, which are sort of everyday around us kinds of things, you know, connects to something that I really hold dear, which is the power of looking closely at things that might otherwise we may not look closely at because they seem so ordinary. And I think your point that once you start to look at a dog or a cow or a dandelion or whatever, you just begin to notice more and more and more and more, and the complexity just opens up and opens up. And I think actually you touched on something that I think is so true, is the more you look, the more you see. And the more you see, as you said, the more curious you get. Um, that's a beautiful example. Thank you.
Yes, and more questions you can raise, and more things you think about, because as I said, you look like a cat, and you see, look, 10, 12,000 years ago, this was like a wild animal. So it's amazing that human beings did that to a species of animal. So where did it happen? How, like, how similar is, or how cat to its wild ancestor? And questions, they keep coming, right? Because you want to know more. I think this is something that science can foster. The idea that you can, there are multiple questions that you can ask, and you never have like final answers to them. You can have like good answers, at least temporary, at provisional good answers, but you don't have like final answers, and that's why you have to keep asking, keep getting answers. And I mean, this is just great.
Yeah, you bring up something that I could have said earlier too, and then I didn't, but it's such a good point, which is that slowing down to make careful observations, to look carefully, um, tends to generate questions. And I mean, as educators, what more, good questions are such a beautiful thing, and we're so excited when they come up naturally from young people, from many learners.
Yeah, definitely. Sherry, let me ask you about your other project, right? You're
Sure.
involved in the Out of Eden Learn project. Now it's called the Open Canopy, which is a large-scale educational research project that also deals with slow looking. Could you tell us a little bit more about this project and how it came about and how it's developed?
Sure, and it will connect directly to themes we were just talking about. But there is a little origin story that I'll tell you is kind of fun. Um, about 13 years ago, I have it in mind because it's been on my mind lately. I was at Project Zero, and we got a phone call from a journalist who was doing a fellowship at Harvard University. He was a well-known journalist, experienced journalist at the time. His name was Paul Salopek, and he was about to embark on a walk around the world um, to sort of explore the world from the foot level. He had been a war correspondent and done all kinds of journalism, but he really felt like to really know what's going on in the world, he wanted to um, walk a path that sort of traces the sort of archaeological record of human history across the globe, or human dispersion across the globe, starting in the Rift Valley in Africa and walking eventually all along till he's still walking, till he gets to Patagonia. And he was interested in seeing if there was any kind of education connection to his walk that he was about to start. And he didn't know, he wasn't an educator, and he didn't know what he really wanted, but he knew what he didn't want. He didn't want an educational component that would teach just geography. He wanted something more. And he sort of started hearing about Project Zero, and people said, "Oh, you should check out this place called Project Zero. They think a little bit like you do." And one thing led to another, and he came and he talked with us, and we all got excited about this sort of um, synergy between what he was hoping to do and the kinds of things that we care about. And what that synergy has to do with is slowing down to look carefully at the world as it is, starting from very specific observations to making broader and broader connections, and also to sharing stories across contexts, cultures, geographies, technologies. So we were fortunate to have a funder who was interested in seeding a project that would go along with, that would be related to his walk, but not too closely linked. And so we started a project called Out of Eden Learn. And as you say, it's since transitioned to the name Open Canopy. But basically, what we did was we created some curricula that would engage young people in doing the kinds of things that Paul Solopek does when he's walking, and something, with an overlay of the kinds of things Project Zero does. So going out into the community, making close observations, looking for global forces and global connections, interviewing local people, making connections, sharing stories from different contexts. So we started a program where classrooms around the world might follow this curriculum in their own communities and then come together in an online community and share their own investigations with classrooms in very different contexts. And they would do it asynchronously, so it didn't all have to happen in the same time zone. And let me say that we have had some wonderful classrooms in Brazil, as well as in 70 other countries around the world. And this sort of captured the interest of educators and students. It's a program that's been going on for 13 years. It's grown and evolved. And part of that evolution has been to really sort of distill a pedagogy that we think applies to more than just this program, but to learning and teaching contexts more broadly. You mentioned the rudiments of that pedagogy earlier. It has to do with slowing down, sharing stories, making connections. We also add to that something that you and I were talking about earlier, the importance of what we call learner-generated content, which really means just learners generating their own questions, their own ideas, their own observations, building on them as a way to explore the world, and then also strategies that foster peer-to-peer exchange. So that's the program. And Paul Salopek is still walking. In fact, he is about to leave Japan, we think he's going to take a ferry across the Bering Straits to Alaska, and he's going to begin the last leg of his journey, which is a very long leg along the whole coast of Americas. So he'll cross not too far from me, not too far from you.
Yeah, he get to the south, the south of South America, like to Patagonia, to.
Yes, he hopes to get to Patagonia. I mean, he will get to Patagonia. He's been walking for 13 years. When he met us, he thought it was going to be 7 years, but he's
Wow.
interested in he's not hurrying. He stops often to write. He
Yeah.
stops often to work with journalists and educators along the trail. He's not in a hurry.
How many miles so far?
Oh, that's a great question. Well over 10,000 miles.
Wow.
I would refer any viewers who are interested to his website, which is called Out of Eden Walk.
Yeah.
And there are maps and dispatches that talk about how long he's been walking. And yeah. So
That's
that's the project. And it's been a really exciting and fun and tremendously rewarding project. And just to say a word about the name change, because you
yeah.
mentioned it, and it sort of says something about the current situation of the project is, we're called Out of Eden Learn because we were linked to his project, and his name was Out of Eden Walk, the idea of out of Eden being out of the original source of our record of the origins of humankind, our human ancestors. And since the beginning of the project, we continue to be connected to him, but we've also expanded into other thematic areas. We've got curricula on human migration, on planetary health, on ways of remembering the past that are not so linked to his walk, although they share that spirit of slow looking, sharing stories and so forth. So we've called it the Open Canopy to capture that breadth. It's still connected to Out of Eden Walk, but it's also a little more broad.
Yeah, but both names are just great, amazing. They both
I'm
titles.
glad you like them. Thank you.
And like Project Zero, Shari, the Open Canopy provides numerous resources for educators who can use teaching strategies and other activities to promote critical thinking and careful observation in their classrooms. One of the resources that I find most interested in is the Open Canopy Handbook, a book that can be downloaded for free and has a very rich content for elementary and high school teachers. Could you tell us a little bit more about this book and other resources that the Open Canopy offers us?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, we've tried to distill the pedagogy, and the Open Canopy Handbook is our way of sort of presenting that pedagogy. So it talks about all five of those principles that I just mentioned, talks about them in a way that can be useful in any educational context, not just if you're participating in the program. So it tries to generalize them. Along the way, we've developed some what we think are useful tools for supporting this kind of learning and teaching. And it turns out that educators have taken these tools and are using them in contexts beyond the Open Canopy. And those are shared in the book as well. One is called the Dialogue Toolkit, which are some very simple tools that help young people respond to each other's work, whether it's in person in a classroom or asynchronously online in a social media-like context, respond just beyond a mere like to how to really respectfully probe other people's ideas and work. You mentioned earlier, Guilherme, about the importance of getting students to ask questions and ask why. And the Dialogue Toolkit is a set of tools that help students ask those and similar questions of one another. So that's a tool that's in there. Another tool that is in there and many educators find useful is something called the 3 O's, which stand for the three. Oh, it's a tool to help students or help anybody, and I use it myself, engage with people across difference in ways that are respectful and inquiry driven and probing. And so the 3 O's are cautions against othering, overgeneralization, and it is slipping my mind, overconfidence. And when we talk to people across difference, we can easily slip into any of those 3 O's. So this tool is a sort of a way to help people not just avoid them, but find other inquiry-driven ways of talking respectfully and curiously with people who are different than themselves. So those are just a couple of examples, and there are several other tools in the handbook as well. And
But no, that's a very interesting example, Shari, because this is a very important tool for today's world. People are overconfident in some of their beliefs. We are, let's say, people in
yes,
general, we
aren't we?
included, obviously. And I think this also sometimes um, makes us more reluctant in discussing ideas with people. We don't talk to people who see the world differently from us because we regard them as like ignorant or something like that because we are like overconfident that we are right, they are wrong. And we don't open like space for the discussion of ideas, for the exchange of reasons. And it's also, I think, this kind of strategy is very welcome because I think school is a space that can provide people tools for engaging people in dialogue, engaging people who think different, who hold different ideas from them. I think it is a very important feature.
I agree. And let me just say a couple of quick things because you mentioned some things that I think are interesting. One is we've found on the Open Canopy project, I mean, not surprisingly, any educator knows this, that there's plenty of difference within a classroom as well as across contexts. So once students start to share stories of their own lives and their own personal contexts, suddenly we discover that we're not at all the same. And so these tools of overgeneralization, overconfidence, and othering are as important in smaller cultural contexts as they are in larger intercultural contexts. So our educators have helped us to see that. And then I just was thinking back about something else you mentioned a little while ago in the conversation about the language of thinking. And just as you were talking, I was remembering that we see in the Open Canopy, because we see so much student work, that even just having the term overconfidence for students helps them learn a concept that helps them be more thoughtful in their interactions. So I think that these tools are powerful, I hope, because of sort of they're conceptually powerful, but they also teach some language or some terms for thinking that are powerful in their own right for that reason as well.
Yeah, and I think it can be very helpful to help people to manage their biases, like confirmation biases, overconfidence,
Mm,
lots of like cognitive biases that makes us more prone to accept a certain idea and collect reasons that support it, and being unable to see different uh, conclusions and different reasons as well. Sherry, talking about resources,
yes.
you have a podcast, which is an excellent
Oh,
podcast in partnership with Professor David Perkins, who you mentioned him before, called Thinkability, a podcast for people who like to think about thinking. I've listened to a few episodes. The last one I listened was Why Teach Thinking. It was a great,
oh,
great episode. What motivated you to create the podcast? And let me add some questions. And how do you choose the topics you talk about in it?
yeah. Well, thank you for listening to it. And what like so many of us, it started as a passion project during the pandemic. Honestly, David and I were meeting on Zoom and having conversations like we like to have, and sort of one thing led to another, and we were in this, digital environment where we thought maybe a podcast would be interesting, and we started to do a podcast, and it gained some momentum, and really that's the origin story there. But the real story goes way back, and I'll try to tell it the short version. So as I mentioned, when we started talking early on, that I came and was working on a research project with David Perkins when I was still a graduate student, and I stayed in his research group for many years. And there were others in that group as well. And at the time, we were doing some traveling for our research. And so the research team would be traveling to different parts of the world, really. And this is in the, before cell phones and stuff, sort of, well. And sometimes when we were traveling, there would be these, as you know, when you travel, there are these interstitial moments. You may be going from the airport to a conference center, or from a hotel to a school, and you're in a cab, or way before Ubers or Lyfts. And your little research team there. And Dave Perkins would always carry a little notebook. And in the notebook, he would keep a running list of fun things to talk about that you could talk about at these interstitial moments. So, oh, we have 35 minutes before we get to the conference center. We wanted to talk about curiosity. Let's talk about curiosity. And we would all sort of have this conversation, and then it would be over, and then we'd go to work. And Dave and I kept up the habit of having these conversations over the years. And, we would, a couple times a year, we might get together for lunch, or maybe it'd be more, maybe it'd be less over the years. And we would just bring a topic that we were kind of curious, that we'd thought a little bit about, but that we just were excited to pick apart in a relatively short period of time. We picked this back up during the pandemic, as I just mentioned, and it became a model for a podcast. And you asked how we choose the episodes, and that's sort of it. We keep a running list of topics that we know a little bit about. Sometimes we know a little more than a little bit. Sometimes we know a little less than a little bit, but that we want to work out. And I actually have come to feel like I'm connecting way back to my roots in philosophy, because a lot of what we do is try to work out the sort of possibility space of a topic and figure out the different dimensions and what might be known. And then it's an interesting challenge to try to put it together in a way that can be accessible in a non-academic way. So that's really it.
That's perfect. And Sherry, is there any topic that you haven't covered but you would like to include in an episode of your podcast?
Well, give you a little sneak preview here. Maybe we are about to experiment, I think, with uh, a two-episode podcast on a topic that is complex enough to warrant two shortish episodes. And the topic that we've been thinking about is perspective taking, which is an interesting and complicated and fascinating topic. How is it that we step outside of our own in the moment selves to look at things from different points of view, whether it's physical or conceptual or metaphorical? And there's just a lot in there. So we're kind of trying to figure it out at the moment.
Very interesting. I listened yesterday to the latest episode. It's Finding the Fun in Thinking, if I'm not mistaken. I think this is the latest you released, right? Oh, very,
Uh,
very interesting. Yeah. And this is something I've never thought uh, in that way, finding fun in thinking. But this is something that occurs to me when I think about certain things. I just think because it's good, it's fun. Like we were talking about like domestic animals. I really like to read about the history of like dog and cat breeds, for example. And I do that not because I work with that or because I use that in classroom, but eventually I can do that as well. But I read that and I think about that because it's just fun. It's just great. It's excellent, like an excellent exercise for the mind, and that's a great topic as well.
I'm
Finding
glad I could tell when when we were talking about when you were talking about domestic animals and evolution, I could see you light up in a little way. I knew that you found that fun.
yeah, that's a topic I usually in my classes as well. I usually include pseudoscientific topics such like as UFOs, Bigfoot, but f seeing them like in a scientific way and trying to debunk the weird claims and stuff like this is something I have lots of books on weird things, and these are topics that also I find very funny. It's really good. I don't believe in those things, but I enjoy reading about them because then again, it's like finding fun in thinking about those things. It's very, very interesting. I think all of us have certain topics that we are interested in, and we really find the fun in thinking about them. And Sherry, let me ask you a final question. What's next? What are like your next projects? Are you working on a new book or?
Um, well, the Thinkability podcast is sort of like an ongoing project because we're, often challenging ourselves to think about new. So there's that. We're actually thinking about putting together a book based on some of those episodes because they could be interesting to push a little bit further in an essay-like context in a book of essays. So that's one project. And then the other is really the open canopy. I mentioned earlier that it's a sort of an umbrella for lots of different projects. So we are thinking about some new, what we call learning journeys, some new dimensions of that project with Paul Salopek coming to Alaska and then through the Americas. It's sort of an exciting new moment. We're thinking about some new possible themes. One of the themes we've been thinking about, this is very early stages, so don't hold me to it, but we've been thinking about creating some curricula around how to find different aspects of the good in our everyday experience, whether it's finding different kinds of beauty, different kinds of joy. Sort of it's a combination of slow looking and looking for good. We often are working with young people in difficult situations, and we've discovered from them and their educators that there can be a lightness and a joy, but also a sort of a power in having opportunities to look for different kinds of good in the everyday. So that's a theme we're thinking about.
Well, that's great. Shari, again, thank you very much for being with us today. Your work is just great, and I'm very happy to talk to you and to have you here. Thank you very much.
Well, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And I love your work, and I can continue to, I look forward to seeing what new YouTube videos you offer and what new
All
materials
right.
come.
And it was nice to see that, to hear that you and Harvey C were colleagues. This was
Yeah.
great.
Okay. Take
Shari,
care.
thank you very much.